Welcome to the Advancement Podcast. Our mission is to reach the lost in America by advancing leaders and churches so that communities are transformed. Join us as we discuss how to stay healthy as leaders, work in teams, and lead change. Come on, let's advance together.
Welcome back to another episode of the Advancement Podcast. Hey, if you enjoy what you're listening to, if you could click subscribe, and if you could also rate us on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to, it would help us spread the message of advancement all over the world. If you're watching, if you could click subscribe in YouTube and like on Facebook. My name is Todd. I am the host of the Advancement Podcast here with the great Timothy Ware. How you doing, Tim? Hey, man, we hadn't seen each other.
Great. I still don't know. I'm not sure why you say that all the time. I mean, I appreciate it, but
it
feels weird.
We hadn't seen each other in 3 weeks. I mean,
2 weeks.
Well, it feels like forever, Tim.
It feels like forever. I'm so sad.
Of course, our listeners don't notice that we haven't been here because we batch record and we release them.
Yeah.
And
I'm not sure what to think about this shirt you're wearing.
Like my shirt? It's thank you, Old Navy. It's
it says the man, the myth, the legend.
And then when I saw that on oldnavy.com, I was like, I got to get that for a podcast day. Just so Tim will give me a hard time for wearing
There you go.
So
you got it. As soon as you walk through the door, what is that?
It was worth the $10 at oldnavy.com. So
yeah. So Todd, I'm always picked on this show for being the old guy.
Yes.
You pick on me for being the old guy. Now, we did have somebody who, a listener who said that you were an ageist.
Yeah, I did have, it was a few weeks ago. He said that I was an ageist, and he felt bad for you. Of course, when he said this, he was laughing as he was saying it.
Well,
so
I should know that. I want you to know that I had another listener who was talking to me, and they said, Todd he's always in trouble. He just doesn't. Sometimes I'm not sure. He acts like he doesn't have a clue.
Oh yeah.
But thank you,
listener. I appreciate that.
You went to kids camp.
Yes.
So you were the old guy.
I was the old guy.
How'd it feel?
It was good. I asked the kids, I go, how old do you think I am? They go, 40, 42. I was like, wow, that's great. Thanks, guys.
No longer a millennial.
Yeah, I know. They took me out of the millennial bracket. Yeah, but
that's so awesome.
I was like, guys, I'm actually 35. But it's okay. Kids camp reminded me I'm not as young as I used to be. The last time I did camp, I was in my 20s. And so the body felt a little different in the 30s, running around all day, up and down hills and all that. So, I felt my age a little bit too. It was all right. Hey, but back by popular demand today, probably our most...
We had lots. We had when Dr.
Feedback.
Suzie was on. We had people who were just retweeting and commenting on some of the things that she said. Yeah. Some of those one-liners she gave us. They were like, "Oh, those were awesome." Yeah. So
everybody loved when she punched me in the gut. Thanks.
It's true.
Thanks, Dr. Suzie. Appreciate that.
So it's great to have Dr. Suzie Macaluso back with us today.
Yay!
On the podcast. Yes, and she's home in Abilene, Texas.
God's country.
In her office, God's country is Abilene.
That's what people from Abilene say. Now you got to remember, my wife.
Did you see the face she made when you said
that? My wife's from Abilene, so in my house, Abilene is here, and everywhere else is down here. So she loves Abilene.
And let's see. She told us a minute ago that she, on her way back from California, she was at the Grand Canyon and all these places. She may not think Abilene is quite God's country today.
I can guarantee she doesn't, and I agree with her. But I'm just telling you, at my house, Abilene is high.
So it's good to have you back, Dr. Suzie, from the head of the gerontology department at Abilene Christian University. Woohoo!
I'm gonna be honest, Tim. I had to look up what that meant. So a good Google search will help you out, but
yeah, so
it made sense once I looked it up.
Last time we had her on, we were talking about, since she is a sociologist, we were talking about we had her on to discuss COVID-19 and how the church would respond. But finding out that she works in this gerontology field, this is an issue within the church, and so we're so excited to have, dare I say, another millennial on the show.
Woohoo!
I am a millennial.
Yeah. Another millennial on the show to talk about this topic.
We love you, Pawpaw. It's okay.
I am not a pawpaw yet.
Soon enough. Soon enough.
Not that soon.
You're not hoping for that day?
I'm hoping for it, but since my kids are both in their 20s, early 20s, and neither one of them have anyone in their life that's a significant person, we're not rushing this.
Could happen in an instant, Tim. You never know.
So, Dr. Suzie, how are you? How's Abilene? What's going on?
I'm good. Abilene's good. It's hot as usual, and we've just been, laying low, getting back in the swing of things, trying to prepare for fall and the myriad of options and things that might happen. But yeah, we're doing well.
I have to ask you, because you told us when you were with us before that as a parent, as a millennial, as a young mother, and all of these things, you couldn't see yourself going back to an organized large church gathering. Y'all were gonna do the online church thing. You said back 100 days. You said 90 to 100 days, and so I have to ask: have you been back?
We have not stepped foot in a church in all that time, but we have continued to connect with our church family through Zoom church. And that has been really centering for us, kind of that Sunday morning gathering. And then we do a Wednesday night prayer gathering. And that's helped really set the tone for our weeks. It's been hard on the kids. I think the hardest on them. But we have started to kind of get together with, one friend or one family at a time. And then we've had shepherds at our church have invited us to come to their house to swim or whatever, and they'll stay distanced, but still allow themselves to see us. So yeah, we have not been to church. Our church is smaller and has a very high proportion of older members. And also very, very high proportion of graduate degrees. And so a lot of people who know a lot of science and things.
Was that a shot across the bow?
I think that could have been, well, but both of us have graduate degrees.
Yes, we do.
Of course, your graduate degrees in theology.
Yes.
And my graduate degrees in leadership, so they might not be considered scientific degrees.
Hey.
Theology did not prepare me for COVID at all. So, other than trust the Lord, I got that one.
Well, I had to ask. I've been thinking about it as I've been knowing she's coming, and I'm not making fun, because I think there's still wisdom as that. We all have to make our choices, but the beautiful thing is that you haven't been disconnected from the church.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. But we want to really we're excited to have you back to talk actually in your field of expertise today.
Yeah. She did so well outside of her field. I'm excited to hear about her expertise. So.
Well, I actually have two areas of expertise. So my expertise overlaps with religion and aging. And so my doctorate is actually in sociology of religion. And so I came to the field of gerontology a little later by happenstance, that our director had an interest in where these two fields merge, and brought me into some of his research on clergy retirement preparedness. And so through that, I began to really kind of appreciate the role of older adults in the life of the church. And so, yeah, it's been really fun to kind of have these two fields. And especially right now, they just seem to be so important in what's going on in our society.
Well, that's part of the, I didn't realize that that's what brought you in, because obviously that's something that's important to us as we talk, because we have an aging minister population in America. But to begin with, this COVID situation has in some ways we could say has exasperated uh, the division between generations in our churches.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as strange as it sounds, that right now, when you look at the church attendance statistics across America, those when churches that have reopened, it is more the senior adults that have come back because they missed church. We want to
Mm-hmm.
be in church. And it's the millennials, it's those generations that have stayed home.
Mm-hmm.
And some have said it's because of technology. Some have, there's all kinds of things, but what it does display to us is some of the real differences, still the dividing lines between generations. And one of the great challenges that all of our pastors have is how we move forward, reaching the broader generations and those generations that are coming up without alienating our senior adults, alienating those who are historic members of the church. And this is a tension. You know, I have two people that are moving into new churches. One's a first-time pastor, and he was talking about that older population and them saying, well, this is what we want. And, there's already tension in the church between generations.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we want to talk about. And I'm so glad you're with us.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. This is definitely an important topic that I feel very passionately about. I've seen in some churches, some denominations, this idea of just letting the older congregation sort of die out, fizzle out, and instead plant new churches for the young people. And while that might be successful by some standards and some definitions, I do truly feel like we miss out on a lot of potential for intergenerational communication and to have a place, one of the few places in our lives where we are with people in other generations. So like think about the structure of American society, right? At each stage, you are kind of secluded or sequestered into categories based on your age, right? When we think about school age kids, always being with their peers, right? Being with other kids who are around the same age as them. Then you've got, in college, you're kind of in this secluded group of people who are like you. And even in the workplace, right, there's the different levels of work that tend to also be divided by age. So your friendships tend to be with people who are of the same age as you. And even in your own families, a lot of times because of mobility, we're cut off from other generations. So for me, my kids don't have their grandparents close by. They are thousands of miles away and we see them 2, maybe 3 times a year. So they don't have that experience of connecting with someone older than maybe me or their friends' parents. And so church to me is the one place where we have weekly this chance for them to connect and for me to connect to people older than myself who have other types of wisdom, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, church can be this place where we finally get to connect with people who are different than us in a lot of different ways that we don't have in other areas of our life. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Does that fit with your experience?
I think when I look at history and I look at our society, that we divide people into groups because they're easier to manage. And
Yeah.
we put all of our seniors here. Even as you were speaking, I was even thinking about television and our entertainment industry. We've got kids, we've got all the different channels that are for preschoolers. We've got this and we've got that. So everybody's got their own thing. And if you're watching one, they know what demographic watches their channel because some channels, if you're watching the old movies or you're watching reruns of something, then it's there. Then it's, you know, it's the I've fallen and I can't get up commercial, right? It's the
Yeah, I joke with my dad. I was like, Fox News has all the Life Alert commercials, Dad, just for you.
you know, so you realize that even researchers have done so much because they know where these audiences are, and we do have that. And I think that historically, part of the tension in what would be my parents' generation, you know, my dad will be 79 in a couple of weeks, and at 79 years old, you know, he grew up in a society, you know, he was born right, you know, 1941, and we were not as transient a society then. So it was nothing for that generation to grow up living around and living with, and your family staying close, almost all of your family being close all of your life, and your parents, your grandparents, those kinds of things. And you know, my mom talks about those things. And in a transient global, dare I say, technological society, we don't have those interactions that we used to have. I mean, I was even speaking with someone recently about the way the church used to operate, when you realize that it's only 100 years ago that we still had in many rural communities your circuit pastor, your circuit preacher. So, and people lived with their families. It was the Waltons. I mean, that's what it was.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important to note that is very much the white experience. So I think it's also important to note that for especially Hispanic and Asian Americans, they didn't necessarily have that experience because they were largely immigrant families. And so they would have been cut off physically from families. And then if we go further back, of course, the African-American experience in the United States is very different because of the forcible removal of families. And so the family structure is different. But I think it's really important. I think that's a really important note, though, that you would have been living in a smaller town, and even just the size of the community would have necessitated you interacting with older adults. So whether or not they were biologically related, you still would have had those interactions. And I think that's very different from our society today. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, the Industrial Revolution and the move to working adults in a family. And so you need places for these kids to go, right? And so the rise of teenagerhood and young adulthood, those are more recent phenomena. And so children stay children longer. So we have this like need to give them specialized instruction. And that's not wrong. I don't think that children's ministry is wrong. I don't think that youth groups are wrong. I think that there's room for specialized instruction or groups to meet special needs, as well as a time for intergenerational interaction, and that those can coexist or happen even at the same time.
So you just said something I haven't thought about before. You said children stay children longer. I know that recently they've, in the last decade, they've said that adolescence that used to end at 17 to 18 now extends up into a college age. And, you know, it's that they're not young adults anymore. They're still kids till they graduate college, and then they're on their own, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it really goes back to this move from kind of family farming to industrialization, right? And with the advent of industrialization, then children were working in factories, but then comes along the labor movement of the early 1900s that says, hey, that's not a great idea to make children work for pennies. And so then children become this protected group. And so what do we do with them, right? So they go to school. That's what we do with them. And we institute universal education in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But then as we move from being an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy, our needs are different. We don't need physical labor. I mean, we do still need some of it, but we need technological labor, which means people need to go to college, whether that be a trade school or a traditional four-year school, but people are becoming more educated. So that's what's kind of increasing that length of childhood, is that people aren't moving out on their own as early. Now, again, there are still people who at age 17, 18 are, because they're not going to college, because college is still not for everyone. And
Right.
That's a whole other topic. But I think that's really interesting, the way that has kind of lengthened out, and that kind of matches with our longer life expectancies, right? We have more time to reach some of these milestones that we used to reach earlier because we're living longer lives.
Well, I guess, when you start thinking about the divided generation, the fact that society has segmented our population so intentionally, strategically. I mean, we even now, we have the traditionalists, the boomers, the Gen Xers, those things didn't exist before. Now we've got all these definitions for who's who. We're continuing to divide them. And when that comes into the church, that's where the church, I think, feels the need to divide also.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have leaders, church experts and research saying that as a pastor, you're really equipped to reach people about 10 years either side of you effectively. This begins to intensify. Well, this is the group we should be reaching while I'm the leader. So,
and one question I have as you're talking, Suzie, is where do you think the greatest divide in the church is? Because I have an idea of where it is, but where do you think is probably the greatest divide, to where the older congregants feel more shut out than maybe the younger congregants would?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it depends on the congregation. So congregations have their own personalities. And so I don't want to overgeneralize, because then I'm going to get comments. But I also understand.
Just come to us. Don't worry about it.
There you go.
We'll field your comments.
We'll just say, she's a guest. She won't be back. It's fine. I'm joking. You'll be back.
But also it's important to understand, right, that there are commonalities. So I think there are some differences. I mean, the starkest difference is probably when people talk about millennials versus baby boomers, and we just skip Gen X altogether. The hate used to be against Gen X.
Yes, I know, but now we're nothing.
You're just off because you're at this like sweet spot of middle age, where you're
It's a sweet spot, Tim. It's a sweet spot. That's what it is.
Is that what this is called?
You're not retired yet, so people aren't angry at you for retiring.
Not the pastor yet.
Well, the unique thing about being in my generation is because people are aging longer. There's the research. I know you're going to be familiar with Shaw's work on generations, and how his work says that when the boomers are finally stepping aside in leadership, everybody's most of the people that are taking their place are Gen Xers and are millennials, and Gen X is never getting a moment to be the generation in charge. They were a smaller generation and everybody wants new, fresh leadership. So we're jumping to you guys and we get skipped. So we're just used to it.
Let's take a moment and hear a word about advancement.
Timware has been a huge benefit and blessing to me personally, as well as to my church. When Tim and I first connected in a coaching setting, my church was running in the 130 range. We now run 260, plus we have a really strong online audience. We went through a process of rebranding and changing our name, focusing on our vision, and shifting our culture in a lot of arenas. Tim was invaluable to talk us through that. He came out and met with our team. He was a huge, huge blessing. I highly, highly recommend Advancement.
Now let's get back to the podcast.
Well, I think it's also important to understand that the cutoffs for generations are fuzzy.
Yes.
Right? There's not a clear demarcation. What makes a generation is some sort of defining cultural shared experience that creates a unity around a particular group. So millennials are kind of weird because we go from the early 80s through the 90s. And I think about my own experience as an elder millennial, kind of on the cusp, and how different that is from, say, my first students, right? When I first started teaching in college, who were also technically millennials. And it was just, there was such a divide between us. And so we've got to think about what is the thing that shapes a generation, because that helps to understand what shapes their attitudes in church. So what has been the defining characteristic of that generation? So for boomers, the Cold War is a really important kind of marker for their experience, right? And a lot of that has to do with the combination or the bringing together of religion and patriotism, right? And so boomers tend to see kind of religion and patriotism more aligned. And that was a strategy used by politicians in the 50s and 60s to talk about us as God-fearing Americans and communists as godless, right?
That's right.
And
yeah.
that's not a threat that I lived under, right? The threats that I saw were different. And my experience wasn't defined by the Cold War, right? It was defined by maybe more of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of technology and the rise of communication and globalism. And can you see how that would bring us into some tension, and how some conversations that we might have might be in tension because of that? And so when we're thinking about church and we're thinking about reaching everyone, I think we start with this acknowledgement of why we might have some differences. And then also acknowledging that we can learn from those differences, that if we just acknowledge that my experience isn't the only experience, then I don't get mad because someone doesn't seem to understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Instead, I have a new empathy and an ability to say, oh, I didn't think of it that way. Tell me more about that, right? Instead of that automatic judgment place of like, you just don't understand, you don't get it, right? And I think that's important kind of starting place, especially for your general membership.
Of course, when you think about that tension, and you're right. I believe you're exactly on point that the key is acknowledgement. But the unique thing about the differences in these generations is that same boomer, that previous generation has that value of a top-down authority, that I'm in charge, and you just have to listen. You haven't earned the right to have your say. And in a global society, we all have our say. And actually, my opinion matters just as much or more, because we've moved to a me generation. And so even acknowledging that just because that different is okay outside of ethnicity and race is not a happy place for us in our world.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that particular Generation Z, so younger than millennials, that's what they are looking for. They are looking for people who have this ability to say difference is okay. And this is difficult for churches because we have some firm rules, right? There are some lines in the sand that churches do not cross, right? And depending on what denomination, those might be in different places. And that can be really hard for someone who's in a much more kind of rule following generation to acknowledge that maybe some of these rules can be more elastic, right? That they don't have to be as firm, or that we can accept someone in who doesn't necessarily follow all of those rules with the expectation that we are going to help shape them, right? Or encourage growth or better understanding of why these rules exist, right? And so for younger, for the types of people that most churches are wanting to recruit, right? Young adults, keeping high schoolers engaged past graduation and past the time that they're in their parents' house, and helping them to form a full, vibrant spirituality. If you want those folks to stay, then we've got to have some kind of room for conversation. They're not going to accept this. That's just the way it is. Because they've never had to accept that. They've been taught to critically think. That's been our job as educators, is teaching critical thinking, always questioning. And that's very different from the way education was for, particularly for boomers.
Well, it wasn't. I mean, I remember going to school. I mean, I was the odd man out because I did question everything. I wanted to know why.
Yeah.
But that was just I was one of the original inquiring minds who wanted to know.
What she's saying is you'd fit in well with the younger generation.
I do have some of that. I have always had some
Except
of that.
for your cowboy boots. But
cowboy boots have nothing to do with my generation. Have to do with my lifestyle. That's a different thing. But I when I'm listening to you talk about this, there is the tension in generations over how the gospel's presented and over the gospel of Jesus and what the gospel looks like and what it should represent, and part of that's because every generation, the way we interpret the purity of the gospel, when we can come back to that purity piece of the gospel, it really does have an anchor. It really is the piece that we have to center around, but we usually center around how we live out the gospel, how it was lived out when I was a kid. We went to church 3 times a week, and twice on Sunday. And now that we don't, it's a bad thing. Yeah. And I don't, and I know that tension exists. So Suzie, help. Let's ask. Let's let the pastor ask his. He always gets on me that this is you're too philosophical, that I'm not practical enough. So we'll let him ask the practical question.
Well, the practical question would be, for me, the most tension I get tends to be towards choice of worship. Mm-hmm. So would you say that is the biggest dividing line as far as generations go, or is that just the scapegoat? Because at times I think it's just the scapegoat, because it's not really, I mean, a song is a song and we're just worshiping, but sometimes I think they're using worship as holding on to what used to be, and now everything's shifting. I don't know.
Todd can't get over the worship wars.
No, I still hear about it. Like, we're primarily younger church, but I still hear from several of my older congregants who come and go, Pastor, it'd be great if we do a hymn every once in a while. So that's usually what I get.
It's a common question. And so I also have to acknowledge some bias that I have. So I am a member of a Church of Christ, which is an a cappella tradition. And the Church of Christ I attend sings old school hymns, like nothing past, no worship songs, nothing past the 1980s.
Probably nothing past the 1960s or 50s.
Well, so we have a few newer worship songs that we throw in every now and then, but most of them are coming from the 17 and 1800s.
Kicking it old school.
And it's not something that we're looking to change in our congregation. Sure. But I have worked with congregations that have moved to more contemporary styles of worship, or gone to kind of 2 worship services, one that's more traditional hymn, one that's more contemporary worship. And what we find is that you kind of increase the divide because you then become like your two different churches. And you're going to end up with younger people, typically people my age are not going to gravitate towards the hymnal, more traditional style of worship. You also end up with weird things about timing. And for people with very young kids, sometimes they want the contemporary worship at a different time. Then you have debates over that. I think it can work if there are other opportunities to provide intergenerational interaction that is positive and meaningful. And so if you have two different styles of worship, and I think this is also true when you just have two worship times, where you, even if they're very similar in their style, this can be problematic, where certain people, they tend to cluster and they tend to start to self-segregate because we're very comfortable with people who are in similar life phases as us. And so you'll start to see young families going to one particular service because it works best with nap times or something like that. And so you've got to have some place for these people to come together. So if that's the decision that the church makes, which I can certainly see why a church would choose to do two services, because one, if you're big enough that you need two services anyway, then you might as well have one that kind of meets the spiritual needs of one group and another that meets the spiritual needs of another group, right? That makes a lot of logical sense. But you've got to have somewhere for these folks to come together. Whether that be a Wednesday night, whether it be through small groups, whether it be through, a Sunday school class, there's got to be somewhere where these groups can interact and come together, which means that your classes or your small groups need to be intergenerational and not just focused on, okay, here's our small group for families, or it's a small group of just people who happen to be friends already, right? You're going to have to force people out of their comfort zones in some way. Does that make sense?
I completely, I love what you said, that when we divide these by traditional versus contemporary or whatever, that we increase the divide. That was the easy way to deal with this issue for a long time. Now, one of the things that we've always said is that if you go to two services, make them exactly alike, as much as possible, because number one, if that's where your growth was, then you don't want to divide and hurt the growth. Mm-hmm. Because that's one of the things that often happens there, is one will be growing and the other's not, and you put energy into somewhere where there's not life. But I think increasing the division, Jesus talks in John 15 and John 17 about the church coming together and being one and being unified. We see this piece, and I this idea of intentionally dividing does feel in my heart, it always has created a little more tension. And so what I hear you saying is, if you're growing and you have to divide, that's cool, but you have to create intergenerational moments intentionally, which is not I can't think of many churches that are intentional about, say, creating those moments, other than just a y'all come and whoever comes kind of thing.
Yeah, I've been a part of a couple of churches that did this well, and I've been a part of churches that don't do this well. So a church that I attended in Indiana when I was in grad school, they would mix up their Sunday night small groups every year. So you wouldn't be in the same small group forever. And you could choose to be with some of the same people. But there was one year where they split everyone based on geographic location, because I think this is when gas prices were really going high. This was like 2006, 2007, maybe. Yeah, it was somewhere around there. And I ended up in a small group with people I didn't really know, who were older than me, who became some really great mentors as my husband and I were starting our relationship, as we got engaged, there were people there who had also gone to graduate school who were able to give me some guidance on getting the dissertation done. And there were also people my age. So there was about, I think, 8 or 10 of us from lots of different walks of life. And I found that to be a really powerful small group that was really beneficial to me. And that small group continued, I think, for 2 years, and then switched again, and we actually moved away. And then I've been a part of churches where there's no room for intergenerational interaction. And I think about growing up, we didn't have a structured kind of all church Bible class because I didn't grow up Church of Christ. And the youth group, like, we didn't go to the main service. You went straight to youth group. You weren't even in the
I
worship.
hate that. I hate that.
And we didn't take communion every Sunday, so you would take communion whenever with your youth group. And so it really created this huge divide in the congregation. And it was a pretty thriving congregation, but it meant that when the youth, it's in the same town as Bethel, which you've all heard of Bethel. That's where I grew up, but I didn't go to Bethel. But when Bethel started growing and especially their worship music started to take off, the youth left our church because they didn't feel connected to it. They only felt connected to the youth group. Well, if the whole youth group is going to go together over here, then we're all going to go over here. And I mean, they're all being fed and they're all, engaging in spiritual activity. But to me, that's very sad. And that's not what you want in church.
So the generational piece is not just what you just talked about is not just connecting our seniors, but it's also connecting the next generation in. One of the things that we talk about advancement all the time when I work with pastors, I tell them that a healthy youth group is not how many meet in their youth meeting, but how many are integrated into the life of the church. Yeah. So that's how we measure success. Is we're looking for a percentage of the congregation to be represented in the life of the church, being in this age bracket. Well, we're going to have Suzie back on and talk a little more about this idea of intergenerations and in the church. So, Todd, I saw you taking some notes. What's your takeaway from what you heard Dr. Suzie say?
The biggest takeaway I got is she suggested naturally people are going to divide. That's just what we do. We gravitate we gravitate toward people that are like us. The key is the connection points. And so I want to grill her a little bit more the next episode and talk a little bit more about
how to create
connection points, because it sounds like naturally people are going to divide. We can't change that. That's human nature. But the antidote to that sounds like it's in the connecting points and being intentional about connecting.
Well, I think you're right. There always is a natural point of gravitating towards people who you are like and who share the same values. But I do think it's intensified in our current society because we specify so much in the way we do things.
Sure.
But all right.
Thanks, Suzie.
Thank you, Dr. Suzie, and we'll see everybody else on the next time on the Advancement Podcast.
If you would like to keep this content coming, all Tim and Todd ask is $1 per show. See how to give, maybe even sponsor an episode or series on the website advancement.cc. Until next week, continue to advance the mission of Jesus.